but without any passengers on board. A good opportunity to get you checked out on the Bombardier CRJ 700.
这一关原本是要练习熟悉喷射机的操作，那我想顺便介绍一下自动驾驶的面板。那首先我们打开 GPS， 我们看飞行计划。我们的目标是要从 EGPH 飞到 EGPF。那选附近的机场，找 EGPF， 它离我们大概35海里。那我们把这个机场输入到我们 GPS 的路线里面，这样我们在 GPS 这边就会看到一条粉红色的线。这条线就是代表从 EGPH 到 EGPF 的导航路线。那接下来我们看一下仪表板，左边这个是切换 GPS、切换卫星导航或者是地面导航的开关。那假如我们调成 GPS， 然后再把自动导航打开的话，飞机就会沿着这条粉红色的线自动导航。那接下来中间这一块是自动驾驶的面板，这个 FB 是飞行姿态，在液晶萤幕上面看到粉色的都是跟自动驾驶有关的。那打开这个飞行姿态的话，我们在姿态仪这边就会看到2条粉色的线，那这个就是飞机的姿态。假如我们开启自动驾驶的话，飞机就会维持着这个电脑的姿态去做调整。那接下来 AP 这个就是自动驾驶的开关，把它点亮的话，飞机就会照我们的设定来自动驾驶。那下面这个是解除自动驾驶。那因为是喷射机，我们也可以把时速这边的单位改成马赫。下面这一个是自动对准机鼻的位置，它可以帮我们调整方向舵的操作，让飞机自动对准中间。通常有风的时候可以开这一个。接下来这个是时速，我们现在是锁定在250节，把这个点亮，飞机就会把速度调整在250节。右边这2个是仪器降落的开关。假如说我们有在天空中有拦截到地面上的无线电讯号，来引导进场的话，那点亮这个，它就会对准地面的无线电引导，然后自动降落。我们看到仪表板这边下面有个菱形的，这个是跑道的位置。那右边的菱形就是代表下滑道的高度。假如我们开启有拦截到讯号，然后又开启自动进场的话，飞机就会自动对准跑道还有高度来进场。那有些跑道比较穷啊，它想要省钱，它只装一面的无线电。那假如从另外一面降落的话，就使用这个是反向降落，因为它无线电是装在另外一边。接下来这个是航向锁定。假如我们 把这个点亮的话，那在天空中飞机就会把航向锁定在现在是64，航向064了。那这个是可以用这个按钮去调整的，在下面的航向表也可以看到。那刚才我们有设定 GPS 导航，所以我们也可以在这个航向这边看到有一条粉色的线，这条就是 GPS 的导航路线。这个 NAV 是自动导航。假如我们有接收到卫星讯号或者是地面的导航信号，那飞机就会自动对准我们的导航的路线来行进了。下面这一个是飞机在转弯自动转弯的时候，它的角度可以缩小一点，它转的不会那么快。接下来这个 ALT 是锁定高度，那我们高度现在是设定在6000英里。那点亮的话，我们就会把高度锁定在6000英里。那右边这个是高度的速率，现在我们是设定在1800英尺，也就是说，假如点亮锁定高度的话，那飞机就是每分钟会向上爬升1800英尺。那接下来我们就照着副驾驶的指引来飞行。那假如是第一次玩这一关的话，建议是练习一下手动驾驶，因为喷射机它的操纵手感跟螺旋桨有一点不太一样。那特别是引擎的话，它是涡轮引擎呢，它的动力是比较会比较迟缓一点，还要过一阵子它的动力才会输出，它需要压缩空气。那接下来就给副驾驶来讲。
Getting in line for takeoff, I'll explain a few things. Flying a modern jet isn't really all that different from flying a small prop plane. There are just a handful of key differences. The first thing you'll notice is how different the instrument panel looks. Instead of many small, round mechanical instruments, there are just a few large computer screens. Most of the information is the same, but the presentation is different.
World travel 221, hold short runway 6 right, traffic of the 747 and final.
Holding short, 6 right, world travel 221.
That call was for another aircraft. We're Orbit 526. I'll handle the radios during this flight, so don't worry if you miss anything. I'll tell you what to do. The display on the left is the primary flight display, or PFD. It combines multiple instruments into one display. The blue and brown section in the middle of the PFD is an attitude indicator. The vertical tape on the left side shows airspeed, and the tape on the right side shows altitude. At the bottom in the middle is a horizontal situation indicator, which shows heading, and to the right of that is a vertical speed indicator. Glass displays like these take some time to get used to, but once you get the hang of it, you'll love them. The display to the right of the PFD is the navigation display, which shows a top-down view of the aircraft's position relative to navigational aids and the flight planned route. You can change how the map looks by using the format and range knobs on the left side of the panel. Try it now if you want to. Okay, the third display is the Engine Indication and Crew Alerting System, or ICAS. The default page shows engine information, gear and flap positions, fuel quantity, and warning and caution messages. You can scroll through the different ICAS screens by clicking the up and down buttons at the bottom of the display. Each screen provides information about a different aircraft system. For this flight, keep the engine gauges showing on the ICAS. The top gauges are labeled N1. As we fly, I'll give you suggested thrust settings. Use your joystick throttle lever or the F2 and F3 keys to move the N1 needles to the settings I suggest. The rows of buttons and knobs just below the windshield is the mode control panel for the autopilot. We won't be using the autopilot on this flight, so don't worry about any of that for now. A big difference between jets and piston aircraft is that in a jet, the engines take a while to spool up. This means that if you add or reduce thrust, there will be a slight delay before your action has any effect. This fact, combined with the jet's higher speed, means that you need to plan ahead.
World Travel 221, taxi into position and hold.
Position and hold. World Travel 221.
Jets have flaps just like piston aircraft. They're used during takeoff and landing to increase both lift and drag. Lower the flaps to 20 degrees for takeoff now by pressing the F7 key 3 times. You can see the flap indicator on the ICAS.
Orbit 526, hold short, runway 6 right.
We'll hold short 6 right, orbit 526. Okay, follow the 737 ahead of us, but hold short of the runway. Release the brakes by pressing the period key and apply some thrust to get us going. Good. Stop here. One last thing. During the takeoff roll, I'll call out 4 speeds. When I call 80 knots, glance at your airspeed tape to verify it's moving and indicating approximately the same speed as mine. When I call V1, it means we're at the speed where we're committed to taking off because there isn't enough runway to stop at that point. When I say rotate, gently pull back on the stick and rotate the nose into the air. Finally, I'll call V2 when we reach the minimum safety speed at which we can safely climb on just one engine if there's a failure.
World Travel 221, winds calm, clear for takeoff.
World Travel 221, rolling.
Orbit 526, taxi into position and hold.
Position and hold, orbit 526. Okay, we're cleared to taxi onto the runway, but not to take off yet. Taxi ahead and turn right onto the runway. Stop once you're on the runway and lined up with the center line. Press Shift 5 to display the overhead panel and turn on the landing light by clicking the switch in the lower left corner. Then press Shift 5 again to close the overhead. Before we take off, let's review exactly what will happen. You'll control the aircraft, I'll handle the radios. I'll call out 80 knots, V1, rotate, and V2. When I say rotate, gently pull back on the stick to raise the nose to 15 degrees nose up on the primary flight display. I'll tell you to retract the landing gear once we're climbing. Once we reach 1,000 feet above the runway, I'll tell you to pitch down to 10 degrees nose up and to raise the flaps so we can accelerate. Our initial climb will be to our cruise altitude of 6,000 feet, and the departure controller will probably tell us to make a left turn to the west. I'll let you know when to turn.
Orbit 526, winds are calm, runway 6 right, clear for takeoff.
Cleared for takeoff, orbit 526. All right, we're cleared to go. When you're ready, use the throttle lever on your joystick or press the F3 key to add thrust. Start with 50% N1. Let the engine stabilize and then increase thrust to 100%. Knots. V1. Rotate. Slowly pitch up to 15 degrees. V2. Positive rate, gear up. Raise the landing gear by pressing the G key.
Orbit 526, contact departure.
Orbit 526, switching. Okay, move the stick to adjust pitch to 10 degrees nose up on the primary flight display, and raise the flaps. Reduce thrust to about 80% N1 to keep our speed below 250 knots. Climb and maintain 6,000 feet. Edinburgh departure, orbit 526 with you, climbing to 6,000.
Orbit 526, roger. Orbit 526, turn left, heading 270.
Left to 270, orbit 526. Okay, it's time for the turn. Make a nice easy left turn until our heading is 270 degrees. That's due west. Let's run through the after takeoff checklist. Landing gear, up. Raise the landing gear by pressing G. Flaps, up. Thrust set to 80% N1 for the climb. After takeoff checklist complete. Flaps, up. Thrust set to 80% N1 for the climb. After takeoff checklist complete. Level off at 6,000 feet and reduce thrust to about 60% N1. That should give us about 250 knots. We'll stay low on this short flight, so don't exceed 250 knots and keep the landing lights on. This is standard practice below 10,000 feet.
Orbit 526, resume own navigation.
Resume own navigation, Orbit 526. All right, we've been told to resume our own navigation. This means the controller will no longer be giving us vectors, and we should follow our filed flight plan. Our flight plan route takes us to a point that will line us up for an approach to Glasgow's runway 23, which is currently the active runway. You can use the mission compass to navigate to that point, or you can follow our flight plan on the map page of the navigation display. The pink line on the screen is the path we should be following.
Orbit 526, contact Glasgow approach on 119.1.
Orbit 526, switching. Thanks. Glasgow approach, Orbit 526 with you.
Orbit 526, Glasgow approach. Good morning. Reduce speed to 210 knots. Expect vectors for the visual approach runway 23 at Glasgow. Glasgow altimeter 29902.
Slowing to 210 and we'll expect the visual for runway 23, Orbit 526. Bring the thrust back to about 50% N1, then adjust it to maintain 210 knots. Since the weather's good, the controller will line us up with the runway and give us clearance to proceed to the airport visually once we have the runway in sight.
Orbit 526, descend and maintain 3000.
Descend and maintain 3000, orbit 526. Okay, we've got clearance to descend to 3,000 feet. Reduce thrust to idle and gently push forward on the stick to take us down. Pitch to about 7 degrees nose down to maintain 210 knots as we descend. Okay, level off here at 3,000 feet and bring the thrust back up to about 50% N1 to maintain 210 knots.
Orbit 526, reduce speed to 180 knots.
Slowing to 180, orbit 526. Okay, now reduce thrust a bit to slow to 180 knots. Pull back on the stick a bit to keep the nose from dropping. Maintain 3,000 feet as you slow down. Press F7 twice to lower the flaps to 8 degrees. The flaps will slow us down, so bring the thrust back up to about 60% N1 so we maintain 180 knots.
Orbit 526, turn left heading 230, vectors for the visual approach runway 23, report the runway in sight.
Left to 230, looking for the runway, orbit 526. Here we go. Turn left to 230 degrees. We should see the runway straight ahead once we roll out. Okay, I see the runway. Approach, orbit 526 has the runway in sight.
Orbit 526, cleared visual approach runway 23.
Cleared for the visual, orbit 526. Reduce thrust to idle and begin descending towards the runway. Lower the landing gear by pressing G and lower full flaps as we slow down. Press F7 3 times. In a large aircraft like this, the speed you land at changes depending on how heavy you are. At our current weight, our final approach speed will be 130 knots. Adjust thrust to maintain 130 knots as we descend toward the runway.
Orbit 526, contact tower on 118.8.
Switching to tower now, Orbit 526. Thanks. Glasgow Tower, Orbit 526 with you on the visual approach for runway 23.
Orbit 526, Glasgow Tower, you're number 1. Cleared to land runway 23. Wind calm.
Cleared to land, Orbit 526. We're cleared to land, so let's run through the before landing checklist. It's a short one. Landing gear, down. Flaps, set to 45 degrees. Landing checklist complete. Continue descending. Once we're about 50 feet over the runway, reduce thrust to idle and pull back on the stick slightly to touch down on the main wheels first. Then slowly lower the nose. Nice landing.
Orbit 526, turn left next taxiway and contact ground on 121.7.
Ground on 121.7, Orbit 526. Turn left on the next taxiway. Once you're clear of the runway, stop, retract the flaps, and turn off the landing lights. Glasgow ground, Orbit 526, clear of 23.
Orbit 526, taxi to the gate and follow the 737 on the taxiway all the way to the ramp.
We'll follow the 37, Orbit 526. Okay, just follow that 737 on the taxiway. He's going to the same ramp, just a different gate. Make a right turn into this area. Our gate is the last one on the right side. There's our gate at the end. Pull up to the jetway and stop. Stop here. Excellent job.